Right. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to our CISO panel on how to take a proactive stand against ransomware and extortion. We're so delighted to be hosting the third in our series of panels here with you on ransomware. And today we have a number of visionary CISOs as guests. They will introduce themselves shortly. I wanted to just quickly remind our guests that this was part 3 in a series of 3, and the other 2 are available for your viewing on our website, so as resources. So a really interesting series we've had with a number of wonderful guests talking through all the different stages and impacts and strategies against ransomware. So today's topic is going to be how to take a proactive stand, and we'll be asking our panelists some questions and hoping to get a lot of engagement from you guys, our audience, for which we intend to stop the discussion and prioritize your questions. So really excited about having you. I will open with just talking through our agenda. Now, this definitely looks like a big slide full. We're not going to be going through each of these during the panel, but just some information for you to take back, some resources for you to use before we jump onto the panel part of it. So shortly here, the panelists will introduce themselves. We'll do a quick refresher on an impact framework we discussed in part 2 of the series, and then talk a little bit about moving us beyond prevention towards immunity, because obviously it is clear that regardless of our best efforts, there are times when attackers get through. So what can we do to move our organizations towards being able to resist those attacks and recover from them quickly? We also compiled a set of resources for you, as we always do. So we're just going to walk through some of those and then jump into our questions, which will cover 4 topics: urgency, impact, tools and techniques, and if we get that far, then some personal experiences as well. So we'll start with our panelist introductions. Since I have the floor, I'll introduce myself quickly and then hand it over to Robert. So my name is Aarti Raman. I am the CEO and founder of Titanium. Titanium is a data protection company. We play a part in this whole ransomware defense strategy. And our part is actually in the innermost layer. We make sure that your data is not compromised regardless of attack scenarios. So more about that later, and there's information in the packet. This panel is, of course, not focused on Titanium, but data protection in general does play a part. So I want to hand over to Robert to share a little bit about his background and where he comes from.
Sure thing, thanks. So yeah, I'm the CISO over at the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services. I am out in the Maryland, DC area, and most of my career has been spent actually not in the federal government. This is my first Fed role, and I've been in similar positions as these fine gentlemen in working in tech startups and technology companies in general. So I'm excited to be here.
Thanks, Robert. I didn't say this sooner, but I also want our panelists to tell us the first thing that comes to their mind when we talk about ransomware, because it's top of mind for all of us. And I did a little pre-call with Robert, and he painted this image that I'm hoping he's going to paint for you guys. So, Robert, what's the first thing that came to your mind when I said, "Come, let's chat about ransomware"?
Yeah, I said a dumpster fire, which I think is representative of how, as an industry as a whole, things kind of feel like at times. But I think we're heading in a better direction. Although, of course, like connectivity, the push towards more connectivity and more decentralization and such, as it is, that could get worse before it gets better. I don't know.
Awesome, thank you. Over to you, Ray. A little bit of your background and some early thoughts on ransomware.
Sure. Hello, everybody. Ray Espinoza. I'm VP of Cloud Security at Medallia. Put quite simply, we help our customers better understand their customers, and I'm excited to lead cloud security there. I was previously CISO at Cobalt.io, a pen test as a service company. I have the honor and privilege of leading awesome security teams at places like Amazon, Proofpoint, Cisco Systems, and eBay, et cetera. Excited to take part in this conversation. When I think about ransomware, the first thing that comes to mind is I think just the expansiveness of the way that the attacks have have come to play these days. You heard about it randomly from time to time historically, and now it's almost every day. And I think, there were some figures that were shared internally as we were kicking around the idea of every few minutes or so a ransomware attack starts. I think we're seeing that more and more. It's publicized more. It's in the media more. I think general public has a wider degree of awareness. I completely agree with Robert. It is a dumpster fire. So it's interesting to see how the market is going to respond, and just companies across the world, given that it wasn't something that affected everybody else. It's a general threat to everybody.
Very, very true. Thank you, Ray. So over to you, Rohit, a little bit about you and then your thoughts, and then we'll get into the meat of the conversation here.
Sure thing. And hello, everybody. Thanks for joining us. My name is Rohit Pachuri. I'm the CISO for Yext. 5 weeks into the role, so I'm still brand new here. Been at healthcare before this, working for a company called Collective Health. Been a CISO there for a couple of years, and before that, I was with ServiceNow and Rackspace. Been in security for about a decade now, ranging between application, product, operations, and risk management. In terms of the ransomware or what's in front of my mind, I think, for me, it's more about the data that's being ingested into the systems now. The growing concern about, moving from a public kind of an infrastructure to more of a private infrastructure, and how these data categories and taxonomy kind of fits into that equation. And this applies to my company too. And we are a search company. Yext itself, we're an AI search company. So we do have a lot of public data, but the landscape we're moving into, or at least the product lines that we've been introducing, is going to start ingesting some private or much more sensitive data than what we were used to in the past. So, tying that into the ransomware equation, that's a big concern. Just given the confidentiality of the data, becomes more of a priority now. And then how we place and process the data, within the systems, happens to be one of the elements that I'm, truly concerned about. And I believe these are the things that we're, going to be chatting about anyway. So I'll leave it at that.
Awesome. Thank you. Those are fantastic foundational thoughts as we get into this conversation here. So let me take a couple of minutes and just go through, step through what we will leave our attendees with really quickly. So I wanted to take advantage of being the host and throw some of my thoughts out early, and you guys can react to these as we go. This particular ransomware panel is about proactive defense. And I thought I'll throw something out about why it's so important to have proactive defense. And my statement is, look, by the time they reveal themselves, there's a lot of long-term damage that's already been done. And so you can react to the actual act of your systems being locked up when they get locked up. But all of what happened prior, before you knew they were there, those are the things to worry about when we think about proactive defense. So, I got this fine little bullet points here. I won't read each one out, but the thought is, you don't know they're there, but they're mapping your networks, observing your behavior, stealing your IP, stealing your data, planting backdoors, doing things now that they can leverage later. And so while it's important to prepare and obviously have your backup strategy and your resilience infrastructure in place, but it's also important to think about what you can do to avoid those things, whether it's monitoring integrity, whether it's taking care of your data, et cetera, et cetera. So I think proactive defense really, really important, and that's what we're going to be trying to get at today. So with that said, and this is all going to be given to our attendees, so so you'll have it. So I wanted to remind you that we had presented a cyber attack impact framework. We went through it the last time. It's in the packet. It talks about, it broadens your view into everything that happens as a result of ransomware. So it's not just the attack, it's disruption, it's ransom demands in exchange for standing up your systems, double and triple and even more extortion, customers, partners, board members, executives, collateral damage to the insurance industry, loss of national secrets. The point 6 here is important, that what is stolen in one breach, an attack is used for future attacks. So there is a big circle of impact here that we shouldn't forget about. This was in the packet. Feel free to use it as you please. We also have this other little model about moving from prevention and detection to immunity, which is to say that a holistic strategy has to involve not just prevention and detection or backup and recovery, but also extortion defense. So this is available. And finally, a few other resources. So this is stuff that you can, go to afterwards and look at. But zero trust, you're seeing a lot about zero trust. So this is NIST's zero trust architecture model. We've got some pointers to what exactly it's saying. Individual resources need to be brokered, verified against policy, informed by threat intelligence, et cetera, et cetera. So this type of information is there. We also threw up the latest ransomware task force report. So there's pointers to this. Make sure you get it and read it, because these are recommendations from a large number of experts, both in government and industry, that talk about what you can do. So this is a great resource. Added into this packet and Neuberger's letter to business leaders. This talks about high-level points on what business leaders need to do. Another great resource. And finally, a couple of titanium resources. 21 CISOs put together a book called Back to Basics. It's available for free. Go back and please take a look at it, because this is easy tips and tricks, and then other webinar recordings. So the rest of what is in here is information about, how you might put these things together. But with that, I wanted to say there's a lot of information out there. Please take it, but let's get back to our panelists and talk about all of that. So the first question, the first topic I want to discuss is urgency. So let's talk about why it's urgent and why it's important that we take a proactive stand. And I wanted to start just at a high level. I'll call on Robert, just because I'm calling on somebody to start the conversation. So Robert, how do you feel about urgency, and whether it's urgent, why it's urgent, and what are your thoughts on that?
I think that, we've observed what's happened from recent high-profile ransomware outbreaks, or just even like targeted attacks, like the Colonial Pipeline incident. And I mean, seeing what kind of ripple effects can occur in the economy, and like all these sort of intersecting intersecting industries and fields. I think that begs and like necessitates the urgency that we have as a field to try to like get ahead of this problem, and really be thinking about it holistically. So yeah, I would just reference the last couple of months and mic drop.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Anything to add to that, Rohit?
Yeah, I think urgency definitely should be there, right? We can see a number of cracks right now, just given how our security models are built, across the industry. And, Rob spoke about how their intersecting functions that come into that equation. It's, you just referenced the back to the basics, and I think Ray is one of the authors there. So it's amazing, how depth it goes into even the simple basics, like basic by intent, not by execution, right? In any means, like, basic implementations do take time, take resources, take effort to put into place, but they're super important. Like, especially if you're thinking about, how attacks are, taking place like every 11 seconds now, something like the metric.
That's right.
Right. Yeah. So think about, just let that sink in, right? Like, how frequently these things are happening, and that definitely shows, what kind of gaps we currently have. And this is for any leader, right? Not just for the cybersecurity leader, not just for the CISO, not just for the, just for the risk management professionals. It's, everybody has a stake in that. The breach is going to take the company down. So, you better keep, have the right investments in place and have the right oversight. For me, I think, one thing I commonly see, or maybe there's lack of in the in general community itself, like is a separation of roles themselves in a company, like who identifies the risk, who oversees the risk, who executes on the risk. I think there has to be a clear delineation at the highest level. And even the culture of security is so important. Critical thinking of security, like when you go into a company, like, everything starts with a human attack surface, right? And we can't stress that enough. That's where it starts. And, one user clicking on one nefarious link, that's all it needs, and goes directly to the ransomware topic we're discussing about. So yeah, urgency is there. I think we should not just let it be urgency as a topic. I think we should take the next step as a collective measure and see what that really entails.
Well, Ray's nodding a lot, so he has something to say and either agrees or disagrees with you. I want to say agrees with you. So what are your thoughts, Ray?
Well, first, I'd say I absolutely agree with everything that's been said so far. I think the only point that I think adds to the urgency is that the capabilities of ransomware, historically, when you had threat actor groups, they had their own specialization. There were only a small or specific set of groups who were using ransomware as a part of their attack. Some of the attack methods that you mentioned, even in the slides that you showed, Arthi, to start, when you had a threat actor who entered your network and was gathering information and mapping out resources, historically, we used to think of that type of activity as associated with nation-state threat actor groups. But now that's been commoditized to some degree when you have these ransomware as a service offerings and affiliate programs, two things that they learn from, capitalism and business of, we can develop, this entire, threat vector, and we can monetize it so we don't have to be involved in every attack. We'll just take a cut of some of that. And so because they've lowered the bar and you can allow any threat actor out there to utilize this service, we're seeing the number of attacks go up significantly. And I think, again, it becomes more of like an existential, it's something that doesn't necessarily happen to us. We don't need to worry about it. We need to worry about the basics. It becomes, this is a very real threat to us as a business, regardless of your large or your small, which market segment you serve, or which vertical that you're in. I mean, it's a threat really to everybody now. And I think it's really that those capabilities are available to just about anyone for a fraction of a Bitcoin, to start off, and then you don't pay unless you collect. I mean, it's a really interesting model that I think is it raises the urgency for all of us. What's that, Robert?
It's like franchising a Five Guys or
Absolutely.
something like that. You're off to the races.
Super profitable. The first of these three events, we did a little bit of history and we threw up the revenue, in 6 months, 9 months. We're talking like hundreds of millions of dollars, and entire enterprise has been set up just to do this. So this is big business. And as long as it remains big business, one train of thought is that it's going to continue. We got a comment from our attendees that I want to read out and see if you guys have some thoughts. So Thomas says, I see this similar to how defending the perimeter is to not be the be all and end all in cyber anymore. It's also about making it as difficult to do anything meaningful once an attacker has breached the firewall. We want to make it difficult to do anything, difficult as possible to have any PII that gets exposed. So I think he's saying, what are your thoughts on what do we do once they get in? So any thoughts on that?
To me,
go ahead.
Oh, go ahead, Rohit.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think that's completely appropriate, right? Like, it's all about the economics. One quote you mentioned, Arthi, in terms of the economics themselves, I think I read a report recently in Gartner, them estimating that it's going to be a 50 billion with a B damage by 2025 with not just the ransomware, but just in general about the cybersecurity offensive technologies that are going to come into existence and how they would, strategically and do more of a spear, kind of a compromise against all the operational technologies. I think that's a pretty big concern. And then you bring that closer to the equation about, you're trying to make it difficult and harder for, these threat actors or, any kind of adversary groups to actually breach into your network. And I think, that's where the defense in depth kind of, topology comes into play. And, it also, I think, just adding on to that, it also, it would be wise to, figure out what kind of threats are you, trying to defend against. As a company, it's pretty diverse, right? So you have different business models and, every model has its own, threats that would, be looming in the dark. And you got to have that threat-informed defense kind of mentality when it comes to it. You have to descope the environment somewhere. You just can't, apply the same principle across all the environments and say that, hey, this is how we're going to run security. It's not going to fly. And it's just going to put more, I think pressure to the business itself on how you kind of run that program. I think, descoping it, figuring out what really matters, and then, applying defenses, as per that, I think would make sense. And there's another comment that talks about zero trust. Yeah, that falls right into that.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I was going to actually pick up on that zero trust comment, and zero trust is obviously extremely talked about these days. So I think let's talk a little bit about zero trust, how that plays in. I've been in a couple of places where there's so much use and overuse of that word that people are like, what is zero trust at all anymore? Everything is zero trust and nothing is zero trust. And so let's have a quick chat about zero trust. Ray and Robert are smiling. So either of you, zero trust, thoughts?
Can I just get 15 minutes on your calendar to tell you about my zero trust? So so zero trust, I joke because, my LinkedIn inbox is like flooded with messages that are, some templated version of that. And, I think like the interesting thing about zero trust is like any, like isolation segmentation strategy is it's like this, hierarchy of different defense in depth strategies to isolate things, and then at the same time you're isolating things, resources around the network, permissions, stuff like that. You have this coordination layer over the top of that isolation, that something happens in one place and it informs what should happen in another place. The campy example of some like the Superman logins of somebody logging in from one place to another, informing your permissions that you might get, or the way that you're the access to data that you have, or what happens to your system, like what network segments it's placed in, the sort of reactive based on environmental conditions, things that are emerging as the zero trust conversation continues to unfold. So it's and that is directly related, I think, to the whole discussion of like security economics of like every little thing that you do. Like the thing that drives me nuts about zero trust is people talk about it like this binary state. You're either like zero trust or you're not. But like, you can take chunks out of a zero trust strategy and, pare down your admin accounts from your standard accounts. Like that would be a part of some bigger holistic strategy, or, get better about network segmentation. That would be a part of a zero trust strategy. And then when you layer all those things together and, you start to get closer to what the, like this kind of thing on top of the mountain is, that is like real zero trust. And so, but everything in that like umbrella that you do makes it harder for an attacker. And like, it's all about making it harder relative to the investment that you're willing to put into it and the assets that you're trying to protect, because, you don't want to also fall victim to, protecting the $5 asset with $1 million fence. So.
Makes sense. Ray, I know you have something to say on zero trust. What are your...
Robert did cover, quite a bit of it. When I try to think about it, well, how would I have applied zero trust to different environments that I was responsible for securing in the past? And I think a lot of it is just a shift in mindset. When you were on it, and Robert kind of touched on this, when you were on a network, historically, once you authenticated, maybe you were on a VPN, you had access to everything. Applications that were running in this boundary had access without authentication. You can apply zero trust to each of those different things through segmentation, additional authentication at different places to be able to make it more difficult. So when an attacker, is able to compromise one of your controls, maybe is able to compromise an endpoint, they no longer have free reign to everything that you would traditionally have access to. I agree. I think it's tough, and I chuckled when we first kind of brought it up because it's been so overly used by marketing teams for different product companies, and it also brings many of us down to the point of like, well, what are we talking about again, and what is zero trust now, and is it changing? Because I'm hearing different versions of this conversation, and maybe it challenges some of those assumptions. I think it still comes back down to defense in depth and really starting to think through, and Rohit hit on this, having a good model and understanding of how threats would manifest throughout your environments, and which of those problems you want to try to solve for, on this security journey.
Yep. Well, so from a data perspective, I'll throw my thoughts out, which are purely from a data perspective. I think that zero trust is also about flipping how we think about our defaults. Like, in other words, by default, no one has access. By default, you don't get to see it. By default, data stays encrypted, as opposed to the other way, right? So we switch from blacklists to whitelist way of thinking. And I learned this from interacting with the folks over at Netflix. They have a fantastic security team as well. And they talk a lot about secure the default, right? If we do nothing else, make sure the default setting is secure and one that does not trust, then we get somewhere. So I learned that. I thought I'll throw it out. It's something that I try to apply as we go about our building our products, etc. Didn't ask you about zero trust, Rohit. You got something to say about zero trust?
Yeah. Well, if we're talking about the popularity context, why not throw a few more acronyms? SASE and CASB. Everything conflates, and there's so much of lateral integration between these technologies. I think given the marketing, the push towards the acronyms, and again, I love my marketing peers. They're doing the best they can. But again, I think sometimes it gets too confusing for people when you talk about all these things in a single breath. So maybe separate those out, talk about the definitions, what exactly that means when you're trying to protect your organization or your users or whatever that may be, right? You're talking about SASE from an external standpoint, your CASB or internal standpoint. Then you have the zero trust, which, in my opinion, I think it's just the way you build up the stack and how you see, where the value exists. And then you go, based on, your benefits to the organization. But yeah, I mean, you spoke about it. Default deny, allow some is the model, how they came up with, and that's how, it gained that popularity. But also there are other aspects to security too, right? You got the default, you got security by design, security by deployment, the Microsoft terminologies. And I think that applies more and more now, just given with the proliferation of services that we currently have, both in the security and also, the services that are tying into security. So yeah, in general, I think it's a good concept. It's just, how you take that to execution is what I think is the question.
It's fast getting lost in the marketing, sadly. I would agree. So I thought I'd be able to ask a few questions that I had planned, but I'm so happy that we have so many coming from the audience. So I'm gonna read off a question from the audience. It takes us in a slightly different direction, but very relevant to ransomware. So Joe asks, given an attacker, hacker, threat actor, or just no wait, is that the one? Sorry, there was something about they're asking for less money than it would cost you.
Okay, Gabriel, scroll up a little bit.
I'm sorry, more questions came in. Thank you. All right. Yep, so they're saying essentially they're asking for less than it would cost you to spend to secure it. What do you think about that, right? And they do this on purpose, so it's cheaper for you to pay them than it is for you to put in the security measures. If so, have you experienced it and how do you deal with it? Thoughts? Robert, you got the question before I did, so now you answer.
Yeah, sure. So I don't know that I agree with the premise that it is cheaper to pay them than to put in place the security measure, because that assumes a single breach or a single thing being ransomed at a single point in time. But there are additive costs that would, and maybe there may also be hidden costs beyond the price of the ransom. So. But I think the point stands and is a great one that, if I get my hands on, I don't know, a database of names and email addresses, something not, maybe sensitive to a particular organization, but not, it's not PII, it's not PHI, it's not, it's not health data, it's not, credit card numbers, that sort of thing, then you can kind of you can scale the, what you're trying to extract from the organization based on what you stumble across. And, that's the nature of good salesmanship. And, I think that's one of the brilliant things about this whole threat vector that is also super alarming is it's not as simple as, something breaks and it's no longer available. It's not as simple as, somebody clicked on a link and, lost their credentials. It's, there's this, very, almost turn capitalism on its head dynamic that is at play in this whole in the whole ransomware vector, and it's both fascinating and alarming all at the same time.
Without sharing the name of the company, but I recently met an executive that was sharing they got attacked, and there is a marketing and counseling department on the other side, on the company that is attacking, and their counselors are actually working through the cost of cyber insurance, et cetera, and advising the victim on best strategies and fastest path in an extremely friendly and helpful fashion. And they were like, this is crazy. This is crazy. They're telling me, look, this will be all over by tomorrow. All you got to do, we calculated all this stuff for you. It's crazy.
Wow, that is something. I haven't gone through that situation, thankfully, but something to add. I think Rob touched upon this. When you think about the impact that ransomware has, or any compromise for that matter, you're just looking at the tip of the iceberg. There's so much that's beneath the surface that you don't really get to look at, unless you're, looking at it or analyzing it from within the company. Some of the things that I can't really talk about the attacks themselves, but some of the things I've seen, is especially going back to my collective health days, mostly from a healthcare standpoint, there's a lot of obligatory response actions you need to take, especially when you go, if there's, a simple incident, not even a breach, right? You got to go to the HHS, you got to respond, report the breach, and there's, huge documentation that you need to have along with that. Then you got to do the same thing with the FBI. Then every state has its own agencies depending on where you do the business. And then when you tie that with a breach, then, healthcare is pretty notorious in terms of the fines that are, put on top of it, right? Like a single violation, it could mean anywhere between 20,000, I think it goes until like 1.5 mil, which is really expensive. And then these violations add up so fast. Like a single laptop, for example, being stolen, that means, you're maybe violating 25 at the same time, and multiply that with the number of laptops that are gone. So yeah, I think there's much more at stake. There are much more things that don't really meet the eye. So I think you'll have to, put a keen eye when you're looking at things like that.
Yep, fantastic. No, these are all really helpful nuggets of information. So back to the question that I read half off and realized I was reading the wrong question. So back to that one. This one talks about offensive testing versus defensive measures. This is from Joe. And his question is, given that they'll be able to get in anyway, I'm paraphrasing, shouldn't we spend more time on offensive testing more than defensive measures? So this offensive versus defensive is a debate that we hear a lot. So, your thoughts on that, Ray, what do you think?
Sure. So I think it's tough to say that one needs to be a higher priority over the other. What I do think is that many companies have over pivoted on defensive measures because that's typically dictated by compliance and whatnot. It's easy to get those in place and check off multiple boxes that you have some of those capabilities, whereas the requirements for offensive testing or like, hey, once a year, get a pen test. That should be fine, right? And so I tend to have found, especially at several of the organizations that I've been a part of, is the better you understand how threat actors will really react in your environment, the different ways they can attack different assets of value or anything of value within the organization. The better you understand the how, you can better prioritize, your monitoring and your defensive capabilities as well. And I'm, a huge proponent of like those purple team exercises. Offensive testing is fantastic, but unless you can turn that into, well, how do I make that actionable for our team so that we're better coming out of this than we were going in, rather than just having a report and fixing point items, looking at it from a systemic perspective and figuring out how do you get better over time. And so I think it is, getting smart folks to be able to attack, getting your CSIRT team, your blue team members better equipped with what those look like, what are those indicators, and how do we get it really better. I mean, it's one additional area that I think should be prioritized if folks haven't been doing that already. That should be table stakes.
Makes a lot of sense. So I'll take another quick question from the Q&A. I think there's some in there and there's some in chat. And then we'll try to get back to the different aspects of being prepared. And this is like an overarching question. Do you think companies will consider collecting less PII just to reduce their viability as a target? Right, it's like, no way.
There's money to be made. If there's money to be made in providing a service to somebody, they're going to do it. Which maybe is the question is, especially in, Rohit mentioned healthcare, being almost notorious for, the amount of breaches that you've seen, either ransomware or other sort of breaches for like doctors' offices and hospitals and whatnot, is why haven't things changed for that vertical since it's been, a large target of attacks here, especially over the last 5 to 7 years?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's expensive to do. It's expensive to do right, and if the impact that you're going to have is not is not going to put you out of business and you're still profitable, then you as any responsible business owner or practitioner, like person who is owning and leading an organization, like cybersecurity is, it sounds weird, but like cybersecurity is nobody's top priority. It is never the most important thing. And I mean, I used to think that it was, and I was like kind of drinking that Kool-Aid, and then I worked for a security company and found that it wasn't even the most important thing at a security company. And like making money and driving product sales was actually the most important thing, and building good user experiences and such. And so like there is always an actual mission above cybersecurity. And so so long as that thing outweighs the the unit economics that go into both building a cybersecurity program or just even like a proper IT function at a doctor's office. I mean, like most of them are such small scale operations and they're simple, but obviously it can be damaging if there's a breach. But it would almost be more expensive for them to do all of the things that would go into hiring security people and having pen test, because what would they do all day? And it's almost not worth it until something bad happens, unfortunately. And so it's a difficult dynamic, and I sympathize with it. But security is never the most important thing, and I think we all have to really embrace that. It does not matter the organization.
So that's interesting. So I have a math and economics background. The economics is rearing its head now here. And I'm going to ask you a question.
Retract everything I said about economics because I don't.
So I'm thinking this is an incentives problem, right? So the way to move the security costs forward is to align it with the business incentive. So that's an obvious one. So to develop that a little bit. The other thought that comes to mind is I had the good fortune of being invited to a federal CIO brainstorming session on how we should do U.S. national cyber defense. And they were talking about SMBs a lot. And even small businesses, SMBs, and how security is so expensive. And there was this idea that maybe there needs to be some sort of a government program that literally does security as a service. And I mean in the broad general purpose way where they could subsidize and bring that down. And it seems like finally the incentives might be aligning to where the damage is long and strong and pervasive, and maybe security, there'll be ways to bring the cost of security down. Thoughts on those sorts of things? Yes, everyone's disagreeing.
Yeah, I think that's stuff like that is awesome. I think it's also great when you see organizations I'm gonna riff on some product companies since I'm no longer in the product world. But when you see some product companies take the stance of they'll offer their solution to an SMB or a nonprofit or something for free or heavily discounted. But I think one thing that makes it difficult for let's say that small organization that maybe wants to stand up a cloud native IT shop, something like that. Thinking about thinking about the way that I used to like procure services, like you still see, this is a silly example, but you still see a lot of companies charging like their enterprise plan where they 10x the cost of something to like get SAML, or something silly like that. And so like IT, like getting good security out of the IT environment that you're building is still super cost prohibitive. And so even if we can push industry to be more, either like subsidize them, but honestly, I'd like to see, more product organizations just be better stewards and say like, if you're, going to market on the fact that you, care about security, then like, let more of that stuff go for free and like, just, let the chips fall where they may. That's fine.
See so many organizations that put security features behind enterprise plans like SSO, MFA, et cetera, and it makes it difficult for those SMBs or non-enterprise companies to implement.
Totally.
Yeah, can't agree more.
Would completely agree. So there are a couple of other things that came up in these conversations that I wanted to get back to. So this notion of the enterprise being affected by its partners and suppliers, and how ransomware, which is what we're talking about today, but generally breaches in general, right, would the suppliers have such a supply chain, both software and data has such a role to play. So in terms of proactive defense, what are your thoughts on that? Because that's harder for an enterprise to affect along their supply chain. So would love to have, and maybe we'll start with Rohit, because he's been in healthcare, and healthcare just has this huge extra net of suppliers and partners.
I really wish I had a great answer, Aarti, but unfortunately I don't. But here are a few things that kind of work for me, right? I think we're at a time where we do have a lot of security guidance out there. We have firms like OWASP, open source communities. We have CIS controls in play. We have CISA that's providing regulations, and also what kind of best practices do we need to have. Pick one, right? I don't want to say that you go out and figure out all these things and apply all those. It's just never going to work. I think pick one, see how that aligns with your business goals, but have a proactive measure for sure. The way I'd like to think about this is separate your controls framework from the program framework, because if you have a single framework that's extending both into your technical and non-technical realms, it's going to get complicated very fast. So in my model, when I go into a company, the first thing, of course, after the push assessment, what I do is separate those two things out. What worked for me is the CIS controls. That would be a control framework, the basic principles that we need to have in terms of security hardening across our network components, systems, applications. I just have a single fabric that taps into that, and that's the base minimum, and everything that's enhanced depends on the environment we're working on. And the other side of the spectrum is the risk frameworks or the program frameworks, more broadly talking. This could be your NIST CSF, this could be your SCF, maturity frameworks, whatever that may be. But that has to, come back and marry that with the controls framework, so you have a comprehensive understanding of how these things are, moving forward. And then also, track your maturity as you go along. Not every segment has to be a complete 5. When we talk about, scale from 1 to 5, not everything has to be 1, right? So you got to find the balance and, figure out where that exactly meets. And the most important thing that feeds into that is your contractual, regulatory, statutory obligations, right? It's funny how difficult those conversations get. Like, most of these things are left for interpretation. And I'm speaking to the choir. You guys know this. I think it's beneficial for you to, and this is something I'm currently working on, is to translate those requirements into something that's more meaningful, and how you can interpret that to your specific organization, and have a good list of those things. Have a proper governance model, so you can think both about your proactive measures, about what things you need, to apply from your due diligence standpoint, and also what your customers are asking you for. And second, also, when the recovery happens, how exactly you need to respond to certain things, or, go back to your customers, because that would ultimately be a violation if you don't do it right. So.
Yep. No, excellent thoughts. Obviously, on the government side of things, there is a little more leverage on partners, and we now have the CMMS is, there's a whole bunch of more frameworks and guidance coming out. So Robert, wondering what your thoughts are controlling both the software as well as the data supply chain, and how you think about that, especially in the context of ransomware, right? Because now suppliers and partners are used as vehicles for delivery.
Yeah, I so I recognize the need for compliance-oriented programs like things like FedRAMP, stuff like that. I think they're good programs, but they're also these huge bottlenecks, and if you think about like the risk associated with like let's say us as CMS, we want to buy some widget tool. All right, so FedRAMP's going to cover is that widget thing built in a way that is compliant. It doesn't consider how we want to use the thing. We could buy G Suite, we could buy Box, and we could use it completely flippantly. We could not have passwords on there. We could not turn on 2FA, not integrate it with Okta. We could put all our sensitive data in there. None of those things would be a good idea. And so if you were to like think about the risk associated with buying a thing, and this is like where the supply chain starts. A lot of the programs that we have really only focus on one half of the problem. And like most third-party risk management programs that I've ever encountered or experienced, I dealt with this constantly when I was in startups. It was like, you're fielding these questionnaires, and it's basically just an answer of like how you can like flip it back to the salesperson who's trying to close the deal as fast as humanly possible and get to a yes. So everyone is incentivized to get to yes, both on their side because they don't want to get in the way of the person who wants to buy the thing, and on your side because you don't want to stop the sale from going through. And so it's not great, circling back to incentives, and it also covers only 50% of the risk. And so I think, if we're considering supply chain, I think we need to find an intelligent way to in a scalable way to consider the other like 50%, if I could just break it into 50-50 chunks, of like how we want to use technologies, data, suppliers, and integrate them into our environments. Because there's an integration and usage risk that is like key. If I'm using something just for the purposes of collaboration and, it's going to be used for like remote whiteboarding sessions and stuff like that, I probably don't have to, do that much to it. It comes down to like, basic risk management, what's the asset and how much do I want to invest to protect it versus something that's going to be, holding, my crown jewels, if you will, some of the most important things to my organization, or integrating with them. Like for example, Slack has become this, this really interesting supplier because most people take Slack and it starts off as just this chat app, and everyone's like, oh, look, I can share GIFs and it's fun, it's cute, and we can talk, and it gets stuff done really fast. But then they start integrating tools into it. First it's just it's just documents, then maybe it's calendars, and then somebody hooks it up to GitHub, and somebody hooks it up to Jenkins, and all of a sudden it becomes this like operating system for the way your organization works. So like this bi-directional like layer of access, and it's and it becomes a prime target for potentially getting into other things that are much, much more sensitive. And so I think there's a conversation we need to have around how we want to consider that like usage and integration risk at scale with all these suppliers that we're using. Because if you can control in almost like I would say if you can get a better sense, and I'll like drop zero trust in here around like segmentation and isolation and stuff. If you are able to better control how something operates in your environment, then it almost doesn't matter. I'm gonna posit, and this is my 2 cents only, but it doesn't matter as much if that thing is built in a suboptimal way. If it's contained and isolated, because it can't spread if something goes wrong, or say the sprawl is more limited. So that's my personal opinion. I know it doesn't align with all security professionals. I'm seeing some nods, so 2 thumbs up to these gentlemen. But I know that not everyone agrees with that sort of opinion, which is why we have this still like huge cottage industry around that first 50% of the risk.
I would jump in and say I think that's one of the big reasons why when you continue to look at some of the suppliers, you look at data classification and handling standards for those. And Robert hit it exactly on the head. When you bring in a SaaS application, you bring in something to your organization, and the use of that changes. I've been at organizations where we're like, oh, we're just going to do this one thing that's fairly trivial, and so the review and the requirements are based off of the data handling standards, which may be lower than if it were, crown jewels, et cetera. But if you don't have that mechanism to look at it again and see, has our use changed? Has the security posture of this tool that we're using, of this SaaS app especially, if that has changed, do we need to up the bar for them? Do we need to make a different approach? Or if we're willing to accept a risk now, this vendor who's only going to do this trivial thing for us doesn't have a number of security controls in place, but they're only doing this thing. If you don't have that natural touch point to look at it again and say, does this risk still make sense to us? Has our use or use cases changed? We may need to make a different decision and being able to bring that back to the table. It gets tough. I mean, I've been in organizations where you assess it once and then it's grown over time. It's like, oh, we should probably look at it again. I think it was about 5 years ago we last looked at them, and it's interesting to see, at least. And I think some of the events that have happened here recently are driving many organizations to start to look at some of their supplier relationships more often than that one time they brought them in the door.
Yep.
I would throw a quick wrench into the whole already complicated supply chain. We also have open source, right? So the open source itself, people talk about it, but not in the same breath when we, just like how we talk about the risk management when it comes to the supply chain. But that's a big pinnacle that's only growing, and that ties into our critical infrastructure, that ties into the crown jewels Ray's talking about. And it has, major implications when we think about it from that security program standpoint. So, that's another element also has to be looked at. I know it's a growing size of, supply chain, things we think about, but I think that's definitely in there too.
Awesome. So I want to steer the conversation back. We have about 8 minutes left. And as expected, the time flies. I want to steer it back to what would be the proactive strategies. And I want to throw out this idea that prevention and detection may not always work. We started with that, and we batted around a lot of thoughts on how to better prevent, what the basic toolkit should be, how to enable our suppliers and partners and employees to do a good job. But I want to talk a little bit about resilience, right? So if we do get attacked, what are the two bad things that happen? Disruption and theft of some kind. And so we didn't talk at all about secure backup, recovery, high-speed backup. So maybe we spend a couple minutes on that. And then obviously on what gets stolen. And I am, if you don't already know, a big believer in encryption. I think we should encrypt everything all the time, as long as possible, because that's the one weapon we have, one defensive weapon we have that has stood the test of time. So I would say data in-use encryption now, we offer that, but even if it was us or other people, but encrypt all the time. But let's talk a little bit about high-speed secure backup recovery, and then also about how best to protect our crown jewels. So Ray, you are nodding, so I'll pick on you, and then we'll take the other thoughts and wrap up.
Well, I mean, I wonder how much more it is that goes back into, because I 100% agree, having, high-speed backups, thankfully, or at least hope not many organizations are still, backing up to tape and then having to find those tapes, bring them into the data center, because who's been to the data center anymore? I haven't in like 15 years. Everything's in the cloud now. But you hit on part of it, which I felt is extremely important, is if at some point you expect that one of your preventative measures are going to fail, how are you going to respond? And so I'm a big believer in tabletop exercises, bringing together all of the different folks who are going to be responsible for, driving an incident, your legal team, your privacy team, your technical teams, and start to figure out where some of those gaps are in the way that they communicate existing processes they have to go through a backup. Have we gone through in a tabletop exercise and throw that out to the table? When's the last time we actually did a restore from backup? And do we feel that that process is clear and easy to reach, and whoever is on call is able to pull that in and drive execution for that? And, so I think being able to drive an understanding of who's going to do what and what to expect. And de-escalates the issue to some degree, because not everybody's trying to armchair quarterback the situation, trying to do the right thing when they have some awareness of who's going to do what and what to expect, and finding those gaps along the way. It's funny, maybe I simplify the fact that, like, yeah, we have good backups, and we have, they're immutable, and we can get those in place. That's good. We'll test that through our DR plan. But what about the response, and what about communications, and how do we handle those? Or even bringing to the table, to the executive team, the default stance would always be, we're not going to pay, but what does that whole decision tree and discussion look like as a whole? And I don't want to admit that, but I think it's still important for many organizations to at least have that conversation of what it looks like.
No, I love your response, because one of the things I would have touched on, if we had time, and maybe we save it for another day, is what is happening in the boardroom. And you said, stakeholders up and down, but it would be an interesting bit of learning from you guys, because you're all, senior executives in your companies, as to, what is it? Is there enough you can do proactively that gives assurance up the chain of command that, yes, if things go wrong, we have this plan and we know what to do. And here's why we can say we will not pay, because we can get by without paying. And this is what that means. Any final thoughts, Robert?
Yeah, I just want to plug tabletop exercises as well. And, Ray mentioned the notion of purple teaming earlier. I think, like most tabletops that I've been a part of, it's usually like the same kind of cast of characters, like running through more procedural things. I think one thing I would throw out there for consideration is to sprinkle a little diversity in who's participating in a tabletop exercise. Anyone who's read books like Red Team Thinking or stuff like that has probably sort of picked up on the fact that, like, breaking out of like the sort of cognitive biases that go into the way that you plan and sort of think through things can really help you come out with a more resilient and optimal outcome. And so, like taking that purple teaming concept and like taking somebody with a, the sort of hacker mentality and like including them in, what is typically a more like procedural defensive exercise, so they can ask more provocative questions is really, really valuable, because it's going to get people thinking about stuff that they otherwise wouldn't have thought of. So, it's sort of a different use case for, that kind of red-blue, purple team dynamic, but something I would strongly recommend to, anyone who's doing tabletops.
Awesome. Thank you. Rohit, any final thoughts? We're coming up to the end of our time here.
Not a whole lot. I mean, they've talked about all the primary elements there. So if anything, like one thing, as a global company, if you're in that realm, and we certainly are. So there's also a concept of GDPR that comes into effect when we're looking into the IR processes. The data residency actually falls into that. It's funny how many times, we went through these simulations and tabletop exercises. We didn't really, really do a warm handover into the, when the response itself happens, the handover in terms of data transfer. And sometimes it actually traverses between nations. And you got to be very careful about, how these obligations are very strict about, where exactly they need to be handled. Do you have like a primary and secondary in the same country? Like, for example, if you're talking about European Union, does it actually fall within the defined boundary? Or your secondary, happens to be in U.S. soil, so is the data being transferred there? So these are all, like, even if it's a simulation, even if it's, something that you would do in a realistic scenario, these are all important things to consider. And a use case you'll certainly have to be, throwing into that equation of the tabletop. So yeah, but other than that, all great thoughts.
Awesome. This has been great. The key learning from me, listening to you guys, is that the impact spans beyond your security team. It goes much beyond on the response side. The CISO's job is way more than security. Rohit is telling us how much documentation is involved and data gathering and procedures. We learned a little bit about how preparation needs to take place well before. Ray, in your chapter in the book that you wrote with us, you talked about the people element quite a bit. So I think when you talked about incident response, you actually threw in that people element. I think that's important too. And then Robert does not like frameworks, So make a quick dig at you. And I know you appreciate the place of frameworks, but someone among our guests also said
It's
framework.
pretty fair to say. And anyone who talks to me on the regular, well, they'll probably say the same thing.
Oh yeah, so someone said frameworks aren't going to save you from ransomware, but I think those are all fantastic thoughts. So I want to thank our panelists for joining us. This has been really interesting and informative, and let's do it again. Thank you all.
That's good. Thanks, guys.
Thank you all.